Hello, everyone, and you're all very welcome to the Hugh Lane Gallery's virtual Coffee Conversation series. My name is Kimberly Griffith, and I am an artist and art historian on the Hugh Lane Gallery's panel of artists, guides, and lectures. And I'm here today to talk to you about Rubbish Dump, a painting by the artist Nano Reid. So we'll take a closer look at that painting in particular, as well as looking at Nano Reid's personal history as well as her artistic oeuvre. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and minimize myself now, and we can continue with our conversation. So we might begin by taking a closer look at Rubbish Dump. It was painted by Nano Reid in 1958 and is a work of oil on board measuring approximately 46 by 61 centimeters. Immediately, we can notice the artist's strong, assured manipulation of paint and exaggeration of line and color for visual effect. Like many of her well-to-do peers, Nano Reid traveled to Paris in the 1920s, where she continued her studies in painting and would have been introduced to the modern movements there at the time. However, she seems to have flaunted the traditional route of her peers who were influenced by the French teachers and schools there, and for herself she was more enthusiastic about the work of the Latin American students that she met in Paris, and the way that they, and I quote, lashed their glowing paint onto their canvases with a free and easy recklessness. Nano Reid was quite inspired by this method of painting, and as a result, many of her paintings are covered with wild, rapid brush strokes, including colors like sulphurous yellow placed beside placid blues and ochres. These are much like the tones that we have here in Rubbish Dump. Again, the fashion in Paris at the time was more influenced by by transparent color palettes, while Nano Reid's color palettes often seemed murkier and closer. And in fact, it's only recently that art historians have come to read and interpret their color values correctly. Also, further showing perhaps a greater influence of, again, her Latin American peers and their approach to the technique of painting, we see in the style of Nano Reid's painting, and again, particularly on this canvas, a suggestion that she worked quickly and also without preliminary sketches, preferring a live, rapid painting technique. She was a fine draftsman, and she was known for her boldness and economy of line, and she became increasingly expressionist from the 1940s onwards. She developed her characteristic bird's eye view as well, which gives her pictures a somewhat pictographic effect. This pictographic effect also calls to mind images of cave paintings, suggesting also an influence of primeval art or ideas of primeval art being brought into the modern era, which would have been quite innovative at the time. Along these lines, and sort of keeping in theme with many of the artists that are represented in the Hugh Lane Gallery's collection, Nano Reid's paintings often feature images and depictions of daily life in her immediate surroundings. Several of her works are focused on the daily life of her hometown of Drogheda in her time. For example, the dockland area of her town is one that she chose to depict frequently. While I'm unsure whether this painting in particular depicts the landscape around Drogheda or the landscape around Dublin or perhaps even elsewhere, we can make out certain elements of the landscape which combine together to create a somewhat narrative scene. These elements include a figure tipping a cart down a hill, with the horse unhitched, a boat in a lake, and birds finding fresh pickings. All of these visual pictographic elements combine together to create a scene of a landscape that is alive with activity both through the narrative elements that are depicted as well as and emphasized by the artist's use of paint on the canvas and her, again, energetic, lively, and colorful brush strokes. We'll talk a little bit more about this painting in particular and continue to look more closely at it, but I thought that we might rewind now and take a look at a little bit into Nano Reid's background and artistic development. Nano Reid was born in Drogheda, County Louth, on 1st March 1900 to Anne Margaret Reid and Thomas Reid. She was the eldest of 4 children, and her family lived above a pub on the corner of Peter Street and Fair Street in Drogheda. They were prosperous business owners and publicans, and they also owned properties in West Street in Drogheda as well as in Rathgar in Dublin. Nano Reid was educated by the Dominican nuns at the Siena Convent in Drogheda, and it was here that she first learned the rudiments of drawing and painting. However, her first love was music and the piano specifically, and she also had quite a deep love of poetry that continued throughout her career and served as a source of inspiration for her paintings as well as a means of employment for her at certain parts of her career in terms of illustrating poems. In 1920, she won a scholarship to attend the Metropolitan School of Art in Dublin, and it was her parish priest who persuaded her parents to send her to the Metropolitan School. At the school, she was taught by teachers such as Patrick Toohey, Sean Keating, and Harry Clark. She was known in her time as shy, eccentric, but a fiercely independent artist with a caustic wit. And she was described by one fellow student as, and I quote here, a fierce redhead with keen green eyes behind spectacles. She was uncompromising, blunt, and desperately looking for truth. She's also known to have had a steely integrity and a biting tongue that commanded respect despite her slight frame and typically withdrawn demeanor. Following her time studying at the Metropolitan School of Art in Dublin, Nano Reid traveled briefly to Paris in 1927, where she studied for a short period of time at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière. From there, she traveled to London to study at the Chelsea Polytechnic School, but she found herself to be quite unhappy there and a bit uninspired, remaining a year only before returning to Ireland in 1930. Upon her return to her family in her hometown of Drogheda, she shocked both her family and the town by her anti-clericalism when she returned, and she was ostracized because of these habits of hers that were viewed as unacceptable for women in her village at the time, including also the fact that she chose to wear trousers. While Reid continued to study and pursue her career as an artist, one of her sisters took over the family pub, which she visited regularly, though she mostly lived in Dublin, where she shared a house with Patricia Hutchins in both Newton Park Avenue in Blackrock and later on Pembroke Road. And it's just sort of an entertaining aside that I think both shows the closeness of Nano Reid's relationship with Patricia Hutchins, as well as perhaps an insight into her artistic technique. Whether this is a serious comment or one made in jest, I think it's just sort of interesting to note here that Patricia Hutchins thought that Nano Reid's increasing short-sightedness actually had much to do with the increasing abstract intensity of her work. Now, whether or not this is true is sort of up for debate, but I do think that it's an interesting sort of little anecdote that gives us an insight into Nano Reid's personality and some of her relationships. And following this time period where Nano Reid primarily was based in Dublin from the 1930s up until the beginning of the 1960s, ultimately in 1962 she did return to Drogheda, where she lived with her 2 unmarried sisters above the family pub. And at this time, Nano Reid began, I suppose, to take a more active role in the running of the pub, in the sense that she, around this time, took it upon herself to also decorate it with murals. She was known at this time as a tactless and eccentric character around Drogheda and a determined defender of the town's heritage, which we'll talk about more in just a few moments here. But just to say that these years when Nano Reid and her sisters ran the pub have become something of a local legend, and though today it's known as Clark & Sons Pub or Clark's Bar, they did recently put up a plaque dedicating a plaque commemorating that Nano Reid and her family originally owned the pub, and that this very important artist, both to Ireland and to Drogheda specifically, spent a good amount of her time there. Going back in time now, I thought we might take a moment to look at some of Nano Reid's earlier works. So this is the Lilter, and it was painted by the artist in 1933, and it's an oil on canvas that's part of the Ulster Museum's permanent collection. By the time Nano Reid had settled in Dublin, again around 1930, she had by this time developed a simplified and direct style of painting, which many critics have linked to be reminiscent of the work of Paul Henry. And while it might be perhaps out of the ordinary to talk about influences of Paul Henry while looking at a portrait as opposed to a landscape, and Nano Reid did paint landscapes often, as that was one of her greatest sources of inspiration. I do think that we can see a connection to the style, technique, and approach to painting between these early works of Nano Reid's and Paul Henry's in this painting. In particular, the sort of direct style in which we see kind of fields of color being delineated almost in a geometric sense by these dark kind of outlines that are also, I would say, quite illustrative as well. In her early years, Nano Reid painted many portraits as well as still lifes and figure studies, but she later grew to dislike this body of work and is said to have been much happier with her body of work after 1930. Additionally, the sort of brief period that she had as a portrait painter also eventually petered out because her style was thought by many to be somewhat too violent and too expressionistic, which, in my opinion, is a pity because I think that the portraits that we do see from Nano Reid are quite unique and interesting and accomplished. And that's why I chose to show this painting, because I think that in particular she does a great job of really capturing the perceived, at least, personality of this individual and capturing him in a moment in time as though he's perhaps at rest in the middle of a traditional music session, of singing, of lilting, and kind of just paused here, and we get this great insight into this character's personality. And to me, this also, in a way, shows the influence of Jack Yates as well, which would be apt, as Nano Reid's work has also been described by critics as being post-Yatesian. And to me, I think we can see perhaps an influence or just a similarity to Yates's early, also more illustrative work, in which he was, of course, known for depicting the people of Sligo. So here we see Nano Reid's also her particular skill in capturing the uniqueness and the individual qualities of Irish life and specific Irish personalities, such as what we're looking at here. Moving forward, though, she did find, again, quite a reasonable amount of success in the 1930s, and in 1934 she had her first one-woman show at the Dublin Painters Society at Stephen's Green, which would have been quite a prestigious location at the time. And then in 1936 she had her second one-woman show at the Daniel Egan Gallery in Dublin. In this show she showed 53 watercolors and 23 oil paintings. And also notably, this show in particular was rehung in Drogheda at the request of the mayor at the time. And this is the first time that Nano Reid really felt a sense that her home county had appreciated her work, which again would have been seen as quite avant-garde and outside of the more traditional paintings that were maybe more at the forefront at the time in places such as the RHA, for example. In the 1940s, Nano Reid worked primarily as an illustrator, and what we're looking at here is the cover of the book Ivan and His Wonderful Cat, which Nano Reid illustrated, and this is the second literary work that she illustrated. And this is just one example of several literary works that Nano Reid illustrated throughout her career, and again in the 1940s in particular. And if we were to look at examples from several of these different works, we would notice that she proved herself quite capable in this trade to adapt her style to suit different authorial voices. So this illustrative style in particular was used to illustrate the story of Ivan and His Wonderful Cat. And I chose to include and briefly discuss this one because I think that in this work in particular, we can see the influence of Harry Clarke. So as I mentioned earlier, Nano Reid's first sort of formal artistic training was at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, where she was taught painting by Sean Keating and Patrick Tuohy, but she said that she personally received more inspiration, I suppose, from Harry Clarke's classes on design. So we do see that influence here, I think. And it's also worth noting at this point that upon her return back to Ireland from her travels on the European continent, so around 1930, Nano Reid almost immediately joined the Society of Dublin Painters, which we know Harry Clarke was one of the founding members of. And one of the most important facets of the legacy of the Society of Dublin Painters is that they were also able to afford opportunities to Irish artists beyond the limitations of academic painting, which again would have been dominant during that time. Continuing to look at some of the other mediums that Nano Reid chose to work in outside of oil paints, I wanted to briefly look at this work, which is also part of the Hugh Lane Gallery's collection, called Seabird and Landmarks. And this is a watercolor on paper measuring approximately 29 by 38 centimeters. And here we can see perhaps an example of the fact that Nano Reid was equally comfortable working in watercolor and oil. And I think that each of these mediums allowed her to do different things and experiment with paint, with these particular types of paint in different ways. Nano Reid worked predominantly with watercolor in particular in her early years. And I think that looking at this painting in particular and also thinking about the medium of watercolor, we see a great example of the way that she worked as an artist in this instinctive sort of style in which she worked primarily on intuition, again, without preliminary sketches, for example. And she said of her own work that she was never clear on her ideas when she started a painting. And I think that this is just a really great example of that sort of intuitive and experimental technique in which we can almost see the motion of the wash of water and the pigment of the watercolor kind of blending together across the page to create this semi-abstract, but also, of course, figurative, as we can see the figure of the seabird at the center of the canvas here, overall composition that, in my opinion, is quite innovative and forward-thinking, especially for the time that she was working in. And also I would say that this shows Nano Reid's really great understanding and facility of working with color, and that she was really just working with color in a way that suited her artistic style specifically. And we get this sort of luminous quality from the watercolors, particularly in the blue areas surrounding the seabird, that we don't see her experimenting with so much in her oil painting. But we do see that she is obviously quite capable in terms of technique. Though Nano Reid's artistic style is both quite distinctive and quite individual, she did have a wide artistic circle, including people like Dan O'Neill, Gerard Dillon, and George Campbell. And Nano Reid and Gerard Dillon in particular were very close, often sketching along the Boyne Valley together, sketching monuments and important sites including the Hill of Tara, the Hill of Slane, ruins of the Cistercian monastic foundation of Mellifont Abbey, passage tombs in Noath and Newgrange, as well as remnants of Nano Reid's city of Drogheda, especially the medieval remnants of the city, which we're seeing depicted in the painting by Nano Reid on the right of our screen here, which is titled simply Drogheda. Although they often worked and sketched together, both of these artists utilized the imagery of the Boyne Valley in very different ways, in distinctive ways, which we can see in the examples of each of their paintings on the screen here. So on the upper left side of your screen, we're looking at a painting by Gerard Dillon called Nano's Dream Castle, which depicts both artists sketching in the landscape. We have Nano Reid kind of in the foreground on the right hand, on the right third of the painting, and Gerard Dillon is the smaller figure on the left side of the painting. Of his friendship and his time painting with Nano Reid, Gerard Dillon has said that she had a great loosening influence on his work, and that he himself was quite in admiration of her way of painting. And the Nano Reid, for her part, has said that both artists owe something to each other. So though they didn't perhaps stylistically influence each other, or it's not, perhaps apparent in their canvases, they did, in some sense, if not simply ideologically, have a great influence and impact on each other's lives, both, I think, artistically and personally. And again, just a sort of an amusing anecdote here that shows perhaps both the closeness and the nature of Nano Reid and Gerard Dillon's friendship is that Gerard Dillon had many nicknames for Nano Reid, and one of them was Buttergate Reid, which was a reference to her protest at the Buttergate in Drogheda being pulled down rather than conserved, as Nano Reid was a great advocate for the conservation of her town's medieval heritage. And in fact, the 26 July 1958 issue of the Drogheda Independent carried a letter from Reid protesting the destruction of the Buttergate, though I believe that these protests, as far as I know, were ultimately unsuccessful. So again, I think this also just gives us an insight into Nano Reid's personality, and I said earlier that she is described as being perhaps quite shy and reserved in most cases, but she also did have a sort of fiery aspect to her personality as well, in that she had a great sort of individual and internal sense of integrity and was not afraid to stand up for the things that she believed in and the causes that she cared about. In addition to her fruitful and productive friendship with Gerard Dillon, she was also as well a member of many of the artistic and painting groups in Ireland and throughout Dublin at the time. She was a member of the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, as well as the Independent Artists, and she exhibited in the first Irish Exhibition of Living Art in 1943 and continued to exhibit with them through 1971. She also occasionally exhibited with the avant-garde and well-known White Stag group, whose ideas would have been, and ideologies and I suppose approaches to art making would have been much in line, I think, with her own ideas and influences as well. Speaking of influences, in 1934, Nano Reid saw an exhibition in Dublin of the artist Marie Howitt, who is from Belgium, though she did spend a good amount of her time painting throughout Ireland and on Achill Island, particularly. And after seeing this exhibition of Marie Howitt's in 1934, it was said that Nano Reid regarded highly the Belgian artist's focus on a direct and expressive use of paint. And this exhibition inspired Reid to reevaluate her approach to painting at this time. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, we're looking at a painting by Marie Howitt of turf stacks on Achill Island. And then on the right side of the screen, we're looking at a painting by Nano Reid, which is Canal and River in Autumn, painted in 1950. And though Howitt's work didn't influence Nano Reid in a direct way in terms of a style, but rather it showed her from what she's said of her work, it showed her the possibilities of a free and expressive use of paint. So we might take a closer look at Nano Reid's expressive landscape here. And just to say this is an example of one of 12 paintings that Nano Reid exhibited at the Venice Biennial in 1950, where she was, along with Nora McGuinness, one of the first two artists from Ireland to exhibit at the Biennial, as this was the first year that Ireland had a pavilion at the festival. As we know, after World War II, Ireland saw the establishment of the Republic of Ireland breaking its final ties to England. And so this also allowed Ireland the opportunity at this point to exhibit independently at the Venice Biennial. And this is also when, according to a lot of art historians and critics, we see a sort of resurgence in specifically Celtic-inspired artworks, which we'll talk about more in terms of Nano Reid's particular influences, because they were there in just a moment here. First, though, I thought we might continue to look at some other comparisons that we might make between Nano Reid's paintings and her particular modernist style of working and other movements and artists who were contemporary of her time, but she wouldn't necessarily have come into contact or interaction with them herself, and vice versa. So on the right-hand side of the screen here, we have another painting by Nano Reid, which is also part of the Hugh Lane Gallery's collection, called Cats in the Kitchen, which was painted in 1952. And on the left-hand side of the screen, we have a painting by Marc Chagall, Le Cirque Bleu, or The Blue Circus, which was painted in 1950. And in the time of the 1950s, Nano Reid did exhibit internationally quite a bit, showing work in New York, England, and Italy. And though she was admired in her showings that she had in these places, she didn't build up an international reputation, really. And this is possibly, again, due to her shyness and reticence and wariness of self-promotion. So this just wasn't promoting her own artwork and having that sort of extroverted personality that a lot of artists have or need to cultivate to promote themselves and to promote their artwork. It just wasn't something that Nano Reid was interested in or, as far as we know, really attempted to do. And this may also have contributed to her lack of perhaps wider appeal or popularity in Ireland, where though she was critically acclaimed, this didn't always trickle down to her popularity with the public. Which is all just to say that Nano Reid likely wasn't deeply involved with a lot of international artists or art movements of her time, although we do again see and are able to find and tease out a lot of similar links and themes in her artwork as compared to some of these other movements, which we'll talk about here. So to begin with, of course, we should look at some comparisons that I think can be aptly made to the artist Marc Chagall. So around the time of the 1950s, we see Nano Reid beginning to sort of experiment a little bit, and we see a new sense of humor to her work. In particular, I think the work Cats in the Kitchen, again on the right of the screen here, is a great example of this. And also just to say that cats feature in a number of Nano Reid's paintings, which is just one link to Marc Chagall, who is also noted for his also humorous depictions of cats. And though we don't see maybe any cats in the Marc Chagall work that we're looking at on the left side of the screen here, he did often kind of portray cats with this sort of sense of humor and was able to capture their personalities in a way similar to how Nano Reid also depicted the distinct personalities of cats. But another comparison that I wanted to make here was just this, the idea of perspective and the way that both artists are utilizing perspective in the composition of their paintings. So we see both of them using sort of a similar bird's eye view style of perspective. And this idea of objects kind of moving around and sort of moving around in space, almost in a circular or even sort of spiraling kind of manner. If we're looking at the composition of the way that the different figures and objects in both paintings are kind of arranged almost around a central axis, I would say, on the canvas. In terms of links between Nano Reid's work and other art movements at the time period, I think we can clearly, and we've sort of touched on this throughout our talk here, we can clearly see links to abstract expressionism here as well, though Nano Reid's works wouldn't have been on the same scale as those of the abstract expressionists, and she never goes fully into abstraction, as we can always kind of pull out figurative and even narrative sort of elements from Nano Reid's canvases. However, there are a lot of similarities here. So the sort of organic quality that we find in abstract expressionism is found in a lot of Nano Reid's paintings, as well as this idea of surface tension, freedom of handling, and a sense of inner liberation. So again, thinking about this intuitive approach to painting. There are also sort of obvious stylistic and ideological links to the German expressionist group Die Brücke, which was founded in Dresden in 1905. So the Die Brücke or Die Brücke group was known for their development of a radical anti-traditional style of painting that was characterized by vivid and non-naturalistic colors and emotional tension that was found throughout these canvases. The manifesto of the group from 1906 stated that they wanted to achieve freedom of life and action against the well-established older forces. So I think we can see pretty clearly here that these ideas are sort of in line with the ideas that we see coming through in Nano Reid's work as well, though again, she wouldn't have known or come into direct contact with this group. It's just sort of similar ideas that were happening at the time. And it's really interesting to think that Nano Reid would have been, in a way, kind of in tune with these different ideas, despite not being directly attached to, influenced by, or even aware of this group. So we might take a moment to look now at the things that did directly influence Nano Reid and her artwork, in particular the Boyne Valley. As I mentioned, Nano Reid was born in the Boyne Valley in Drogheda and ultimately returned to her place of birth in the 1960s. And it was the rich archaeological heritage of this region and the different sites throughout the Boyne Valley that were one of the greatest influences on Nano Reid's work. Like it did for many people, the ancient passage tomb of Newgrange exuded a sense of ancestral memories, and these nurtured Nano Reid's imagination. And while she didn't use this source of inspiration, perhaps in the way certain other artists might have, to produce realistic paintings, she did find inspiration in the mythology of the region, as well as the carvings that we can find on the stone. She utilized herself a form of hieroglyphics to hint at and suggest the reality both of her environment and the world around her, as well as this mythological history that is innate to the region. She was inspired by the sense of myth in the past that was contained within the landscape, especially in these passage graves, as well as in the ideas of inscaping, which is the attempt to depict the essential, distinctive, and revelatory quality of a thing, such as Newgrange or other passage tombs and similar kind of monuments in the area. So the painting that we're looking at right now is another painting from the Hugh Lane Gallery's collection called Tinkers Among Ruins. And this was painted by the artist in 1962, which was also the year that she returned to live in Drogheda permanently with her sisters above the family pub. And so from this context, we can infer that this is likely a depiction of ruins and the historical heritage around Drogheda and in the Boyne Valley in particular. And in this particular canvas, we see figures depicted, particularly in the upper middle of the canvas, as well as, I believe, in the lower right-hand corner. And we also have a figure of a horse in the middle right side of the canvas. And these figures are sort of dispersed and arranged around objects and shapes that, again, have this sort of pictographic kind of element to it that are kind of reminiscent of either hieroglyphics or the carvings that were that we can find on the passage tombs and elements of this area. I would say also, in addition to the shapes that we see here, her way of working with the paint, which we see as well in Rubbish Dump, but I think you can see it even more clearly here, this the kind of quality of scratching into the paint and almost removing paint from the surface of the canvas is, in my mind, kind of akin to this idea of scratching carvings into stone. And Nano Reid was described in her time by critics as something of a poetic visionary. Sean O'Fallon, in one review of her work, described her as writing in code about things seen beside the surface, as about her imagination, which was nurtured in the Boyne Valley, whose rich uplands and ancient stones silently murmur ancestral memories. And I think we get a real sense of this in this canvas in particular. And we also see Nano Reid having this facility in taking inspiration from the mythology and history of Ireland and of the area, and using this sort of distinctly Celtic inspiration in a truly unique and original way that was sort of outside of the homogenized Gaelic Catholicism that we see in a lot of what we might refer to as national art of the period, particularly from the 1930s to the 1950s in Ireland. So she's one of the few artists from her time period, when she was predominantly painting, that was able to use these sorts of inspirations in a unique and also distinctly modern way. So in doing this, she kind of brings together the modern culture of Ireland with its ancient past in a way that a lot of artists were not able to successfully achieve at that time. However, ever devoted to her own personal beliefs and integrity, she stopped being inspired by the Boyne Valley once it began to be excavated in the 1960s, saying, "To me, the mounds were interesting when you didn't know what was inside of them." From that period onwards and kind of into the 1970s, we see Nano Reid instead taking inspiration from Irish mythology and the storytelling tradition. So I just wanted to quickly look at this painting, which is part of the Arts Council of Ireland's collection, and it's called Cave of Furbolg, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, painted by Nano Reid in 1973. And I wanted to just briefly look at this because it also notably won the Douglas Hyde Gold Medal for Best History Painting from the Erectus. On a personal note, the period of the 70s also saw the Reid sisters selling the pub and ultimately retiring to a house in the Sunnyside Villas estate in Drogheda. Moving forward into that decade, in 1974, there was a major retrospective of Nano Reid's work that was put on by both the Arts Council of Ireland and the Arts Council of Northern Ireland as an acknowledgement of Nano Reid's significance as a painter in her time. Returning now to the subject of our coffee conversation today, Rubbish Dump, I thought we might take a final look at this painting again, within the context of Nano Reid's personal history and her artistic history and developments as well. Though we can make a lot of connections between Nano Reid's artistic oeuvre and the different artistic developments that were happening around Europe and throughout America during her time, I think it's fair enough to say that during her lifetime, she did follow her own intense personal vision of the landscape as well as the everyday scenes of her own environment, and can truly be seen as both a unique and extremely innovative artist in her time. She led a long and productive life. She prided herself on her failure to fit into any pre-existing group or category. And in addition to being drawn to painting scenes from the world around her, from daily life, as well as ones that drew on the mythology of her heritage, she was equally attracted to what we might describe as less appealing or less obviously appealing subject matter, including things like neglected backyards, rundown farmhouses, and men at work, or in this case, a rubbish dump. All of these elements formed Nano Reid's personal universe and were a deep well of inspiration for her, which were represented in her unconventional, earthy style that it has a sense of expressive and almost childlike spontaneity. And her artwork really, whether or not it was appreciated in Drogheda at her time, it does capture, in a sense, the period of Drogheda during her time when industry was thriving, when the port was bustling, and when the working man would have been a central figure in that area. And to quote Thomas McGreevy, who reviewed Nano Reid's work in the Irish Times, in a well-quoted review from the 27th of November 1942, he said, "It is not often that one can say of a youthful painter like Nano Reid that she is a born artist and a born stylist. This young artist from Drogheda has to be saluted as a genius." And I would agree with that. I think we really get that from her distinctly individual development, as opposed to, a lot of the other developments that would have been happening around her at the time, and how she was able to kind of maintain this truly unique style that's really stood the test of time. So just to end on a few final biographical notes, in 1977, Nano Reid had her last exhibition with the Erectus. After this time, after 1977, her health worsened and she was no longer able to work, and she ultimately passed away at Cottage Hospital on Scarlet Street in her beloved hometown of Drogheda. Since her death, there have been at least 3 different retrospectives showing her work and continuing to study her work, and there's been perhaps, I'd say recently, a renewed interest in her work. And in October of last year, the Hugh Lane Gallery in Drogheda announced that it had received funding towards a body of research and public engagement around the life and work of Nano Reid. So that's all just to say that research and appreciation for this artist is continuing today, and that Hugh Lane's in particular hope to research, curate, and disseminate new aspects of the life and work of Nano Reid. So that's sort of something exciting to look forward to in the future here. as we continue to consider and appreciate this the work of this artist. So thanks for tuning in to today's virtual coffee conversation. And for more information on current gallery programming, please visit hughLane.ie/education. And I look forward to meeting with some of you and discussing Nano Reid's work further.